Good morning, everyone. So today is today is a Mental Health Mondays. So I wanted to come on here. I'm on my bed because I have my kids home from school, and there's very few places I can film and not be interrupted. I'm gonna take these bobby pins out. Anyways, so yeah, I wanted to come on here and talk about trauma, and I want to talk about the imprints that trauma has on our energetic body, as well as, I mean, the physical body, we know there's imprints, but even that, the mind body connection, there's so many layers to trauma that people just don't look at. Like our society, it blows my mind. Like our society pushes through some of these most like traumatic experiences. Like I see people tell me their stories, and they tell it in a way that's so like almost like nonchalant, like they're trying to like downplay it and say like, oh well, you know, it could be worse, oh well. And I'm always so blown away, because I'm like, do you even understand like the trauma, that the imprint that trauma has on your physical body, your emotional, your mental, your energetic, like all of these things? And people just dismiss it and downplay it. And I think it's a societal thing. Like we're just like, we just keep going, and I've heard some of these some of the most traumatic stories, and people just pushing through. So what I wanted to talk about today was that the trauma itself isn't always the worst thing. It's the imprint of the trauma and the aftermath that makes healing from trauma so multi-layered. So what I mean by that is that if we don't process the trauma, so if we don't feel like we've processed it in any way, then there's going to be triggers that happen. So every time that I'll use an example. I'll use some examples from my own life. So when I went through my first treatment, my antibiotic treatment back in March, I was sick for quite some time. Like I've been sick for 23 years, and I had this infection for a year, and I was really not well. And then I went on this antibiotic treatment, and it just like threw me right off. Like I have never vomited so much in my life. I've never laid in bed. Like I'm a go-go person, and I spent days in bed, and like I could not move. I could not do anything. And that was very traumatic for my body. So much so that certain songs trigger that memory in my body. Like I can listen to some of the same music, like the music that I was listening to at the time. I can turn it on, and my body will start to feel nauseous, and I will start to feel sick. And it's so crazy to me that that people deny these connections, right? So what has happened is that the trauma that happened, even though it wasn't some crazy trauma as far as, anything like terrible happened, it was really hard on my body, and my body didn't have time to process, and still hasn't had time to process. So even though my brain is like, oh, it's fine, I'm not sick, I'm not in bed bound, I'm not all these things, it's the imprint that it had that has been left because it hasn't fully been processed, if that makes sense. So I can tell myself, like when I'm listening to this song, I'm like, oh my goodness, I feel nauseous. I'm aware of the fact that it's triggering this response in my body. And I can tell myself like, okay, this is just a response, but I'm not at a place where I can listen to that music, or I'm not even at a place like where I can eat certain foods because I was eating those foods when I was sick, or I was trying to eat those foods when I was sick. So it's just really interesting that we have those smells and those sound associations. So number one, if we don't process the trauma, then we're just triggered. We're just going to be triggered. We're going to have something happen, and then it's going to trigger the response in our body, and it's going to be the physical body, the emotional, the mental, the energetic. So it's going to go all out into all of these realms. So one of the things I've been noticing too with people and talking is that people don't understand that a lot of times it's not the trauma itself. it's the aftermath, but it's also the narratives that we tell ourselves. All right, so I'll use another example of me. So my first baby, so this kind of goes into womb healing too. I've talked a little bit about that. I'll be sharing more and more as time goes and as things reveal itself to me. But when I had my first boy, so my oldest son, he's almost 13. So when I had him, it was a very traumatic birth. Like, it was 3 days. It was ambulance ride. It was it was numerous doctors. I had like 10 people in the room. I had the trauma to my physical body. I actually left my body. I was in so much pain and I was so exhausted. I don't remember birthing him. And it wasn't anything other than I wasn't there. And the trauma that happened was so intense. It was so hard. And what they did was they gave me this baby and it was like, okay, now let's move on. Like, let's, go home, you breastfeed and everything like this. And I couldn't breastfeed. That was really difficult. And it just was like a spiral. Like, it was this traumatic event that never got any acknowledgement, and I spun. And so then I had postpartum depression, and I couldn't bond with him, and I couldn't feed him. And we ended up back in the hospital 3 days after he was born. And this thing just went like this traumatic experience ended up just spinning. And I spent 2 years in this very depressed, traumatic state. So over the years, I've acknowledged these things. I've acknowledged what it was like to have people pulling my legs and ripping this and cutting that and all these things that were happening to me. And I acknowledged how I felt violated, or I acknowledged how I didn't feel like I had a voice, or I acknowledged the trauma in my body. But funny thing, like, he turned 12 last year, and all of a sudden I'm like bawling my face off because there was still unresolved trauma, right? So it's processing the trauma. But what a lot of the problem was for me was not acknowledging the narrative that I told myself. So I told myself things like, look at me, I failed. I am not a good enough mother. I should have never had kids. My body failed. I can't even produce milk for my child. I'm not a strong woman. It was all of those self-worth narratives that ended up running years of my life and into all these other, as I had my other kids, right? And so it's the narratives we tell ourselves. So when we sit there and, I'm working with people and we're talking about the trauma, we want to acknowledge it. We want to validate the trauma. Yes, this happened. Yes, it was painful. Yes, these parts of how this happened must have been so hard. But what came out of that? And let's bring focus onto those things. So it's rewriting the narratives. It's rewriting what we've told ourselves because of the trauma. It's rewriting how we feel about the trauma. It is processing the trauma. So a lot of people don't acknowledge there was even really a trauma. So it's processing those things. And it's crazy. It's like, so my son, he saw this accident, and there was a big fight that came out, and I spent some time talking to him. He's a very sensitive child. And I spent some time talking to him and saying, like, well, how did you deal with it when it was happening? And he's like, well, I just ignored it. He was working, doing a mentorship at this computer place. So he's like, I just hid in the back. So I'm like, okay, so you avoided it. And he's like, yeah. And I'm like, okay, but how did you process it? And he's like, he couldn't answer me. So the problem is that when we don't process it, even though that trauma didn't happen to him, he witnessed this happening, which affected his energetic field, right? So he needs to learn how to process the anxiety that his body felt from watching this violence, okay? So how do we process emotions? How do we process this stuff? So we process it. Talk therapy is huge, right? We can do talk therapy, and that's one of the first places people go, is we talk it out, we share, and that is a great place to go. The problem with talk therapy is we go in circles, right? And sometimes we just stir up this energy and we're not finding a way out of it. So number 2 would be processing through action. So this is a movement therapy. So this is things like yoga, running, different martial arts, different things like that, where we're actually moving the energy out. We're doing something with it, right? And something that where we're really reflective of it, right? Like when we're running, when people run, like when I run, like I'm processing, right? Like I'm processing stuff. When you're doing yoga, you're processing all those energetic blockages in the body and releasing through them. So the emotions and all those things come up, right? So that is, talk therapy, movement therapy, energetic therapy. So things like Reiki, things like energy, work. And a lot of people know what Reiki is. So when I say energy work, it can be a whole range of things, right? But getting to go to someone that you trust and you feel safe with to work in your energy to just help you balance and loosen up those blockages in your body, those things that you're holding on to. Those intuitive people, we tend to pull up some of those things like, what's going on here? I can feel you're holding back with this. You need to speak your truth. You need to deal with this little bit of heartache here, or this guilt, or this shame. And we can bring some of these to the surface in a very gentle way so that it gives you a chance to process it, right? And find your voice or find different ways to do that. So that's another way. So we've got talk therapy, movement therapy, and energetic therapy. You can always look into, obviously, if it's a huge trauma and you're going through a lot of stuff, there's always medications that people may or may not need to go on. There's natural things that you can do to help balance yourself as you're processing these things. But awareness is number one, huge, right? Is being aware of, oh, my body's being triggered because of this trauma. Oh, okay, now I need to process that. Or being aware of how the narratives that you're telling yourself, like, why am I telling myself that I'm not like a good enough mother, right? Where did that come from? And connecting those dots, right? So it's always analyzing what you're doing and thinking and how you're feeling in your body. So when you're looking at all those layers, what's in my mind, what's in my heart, what's in my body, what's in my energy, and seeing how it's correlating and connecting and seeing what those triggers are, that is the best way to work through these traumas, right? So I know this is a really long video, and I'm really sorry if you've made it to the end of it. I'm so glad. There's so much to talk about on this topic. So I hope that I gave you some tools on how to process these traumas, and I hope that I helped to clarify some of the places that we need to look at to help release those traumas, so that we don't just keep reliving the same thing. We don't keep living the same trauma, but also living the same narratives and keeping ourselves bound to something that happened 12 years ago, right? With my son, like keeping myself stuck back there energetically or emotionally or physically in whatever realm that is not going to help move forward. So if we want to move forward and we're like, this is where we're going, we have to cut those baggages, right? And it's not to say that we don't acknowledge and validate that experience, because I can hold space for that and honor that experience and honor that pain. But I don't have to experience it. I don't have to feel it. I don't need to necessarily talk about it. And if something's triggered, a layer of it that needs to be dealt with, then I can do that, right? And then I can let it go and move forward, right? So it's an unraveling. It's an unraveling that's happening all in life, all the time, which can be exhausting. But if you come at it in a really positive and very self-aware place, it doesn't have to be so painful. All right, so I hope that helps a little bit. I am like talking way too much, but yes, Mental Health Mondays. Self-awareness, guys. Looking at some of these different therapies to help you process those traumas is really healthy, really good. All right. All right, so honor yourself, validate yourself. Your experience, it doesn't matter how big or small, did affect you, and let's heal from those things. Let's be empowered to move forward. All right? Okay. Mwah. I love you all. And we'll talk really soon. All right? Okay. Bye-bye.